a classic case of the dream of the policy being successful and the realities that the policy would bring. British Columbians, more than 6 in 10 of them would say every private construction project and every public construction project should be done to mitigate climate change. And when we ask people involved in the construction industry, they say it's only happening in about 35% of them, sometimes with things that are not really that difficult to do. But the main takeaway that I have from this is once you implement this and you inform people that because you mitigated climate change, the cost of a house, the cost of an office building, the cost of an apartment is going to be higher, they are not willing to pay for it. And that's one of the classic problems that we have at this particular stage. It's nice to believe that everything is going to be fine, that climate change will be mitigated, and that the companies will work to get it done. But when it comes to passing that price to the consumer, it's going to be very difficult for them to say that they accept it. So I think there's a lot of more work that needs to be done to make sure that the public understands the ramifications of some of these policies. And the construction industry also needs to step it up and talk about the effect that this is going to have on the actual prices of things. What we saw here is the municipal governments actually being regarded as the worst when it comes to red tape. We have about 45% of the construction decision makers who are saying it's impossible to deal with the municipalities. And it's not a situation where they're going, well, it was kind of hard at one point. They're really dissatisfied with the way things are going. The rating is a little bit lower for the BC government, and it's definitely lower for the federal government. So it's one of those things where maybe the federal government, which is usually seen as a big bureaucracy, should be talking to the BC government and the municipal governments to try to find ways to make it easier for the construction companies to do their job. It's not a situation where you hate every government, which is something that happens in other policy issues. It's ultimately, it's easier for the construction companies to deal with the federal government in Ottawa or with the BC government in Victoria than to deal with the municipalities where they live. And this really speaks about the difficulties that they're facing and the biggest problems that they have, which come with having to respond to several construction codes, several different issues that they need to maneuver, especially if they're working in the Lower Mainland. Aside from who wins the election, which is obviously the biggest thing on our minds, there are several states that are voting this year on minimum wage legislation. And that is going to have an enormous impact in some of the projects because your costs are going to be higher, you're going to be paying more money per hour for the workers who are participating in some of these projects, and that is going to have an effect on your bottom line. So there might be places where it's going to be very difficult to do something like this, and it might lead some Canadian companies to reconsider and not going to some of these Western states because of the wage legislation. When it comes to the election, aside from the fears that we've consistently seen out of Canadians, out of a Donald Trump presidency, the Democrats are not particularly great either. We have a situation, and we've had it in the past, where they tend to be too protectionist. They bring things that make it a little bit difficult for Canadian companies to actually participate in some of these processes. And they also tend to use American workers more and try not to use Canadian workers as much as they did. So on the one side, there's the fear of Trump because of everything that he said and represents and his lack of experience. But on the other side, you have the actual prospect of Hillary Clinton essentially pandering to the voters who are blue-collar workers and saying, we're going to do everything here, don't you worry. So the America First candidate that we shouldn't be worried about at this stage, it is not Donald Trump, it's Hillary Clinton. If it becomes a situation where everything is going to be done in-house, where you're trying to create those jobs, where you essentially forego going through the regular processes through NAFTA, it's going to make it very difficult for the construction industry in Canada to work in the U.S. The LNG issue is quite striking because it's essentially the reason that enabled the BC Liberals to win the last election. And the promise was that by the end of the year 2015, we would have a handful of operational plants. We're now almost at the end of 2016, and we don't have any operational plants. There's a couple of projects in place. It really hasn't been the windfall that the government expected. And what we've seen out of this is that there's a lot of people losing faith in this. There's people who decided to learn a trade because they were told that LNG was going to create a massive amount of jobs, and the jobs aren't here yet. There's investments. There's a lot of companies who are trying to reconsider what is going to happen. Part of it has been the fact that the BC government has been slow to do this. The other one is the fact that the price of LNG has dropped dramatically over the past couple of years, so it's no longer going to be as interesting to invest and to have, as it was said at one point, $1 trillion to spend, when we don't even know if this is going to be $1 billion industry or even $1 million industry, because nothing has happened yet. So I think part of the problem for the government is going to be how do they re-engage with the voters who decided to cast a ballot in favor of the LNG windfall when nothing has happened yet. And it's going to be very difficult to assume that in the next 6 months during the campaign something big is going to happen that might get some of those voters back.